Thomas Kissinger here, and I want to take us on a very special journey through the final remarks given by David Bentley Hart in his book That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation. David Bentley Hart is an Eastern Orthodox scholar of religion and a philosopher, writer, and cultural commentator. And in this book, David pulls no punches. He holds nothing back, and he tells you exactly what he thinks about the false teaching of eternal torture. So buckle your seatbelt, make sure your airbags work, and hold on, because I'm going to take us on this ride. And as I stated earlier, David Bentley Hart is a tremendous scholar. So naturally, he uses a lot of big words and some lofty speaking and some difficult sentences. So by the grace of God, I'm going to try to get through all of this. And if I stumble over some of it, well, we'll keep going and just hang in there. And if you hear some words you haven't heard before, you can look them up later. But you will understand what he is saying and where he is coming from. So here we go. Final remarks. Custom dictates and prudence advises that here in closing I wax gracefully disingenuous and declare that I am uncertain in my conclusions, that I offer them only hesitantly, that I entirely understand the views of those that take the opposite side of the argument, and that I fully respect contrary opinions on these matters. I find, however, whether on account of principle or of pride, that I am simply unable to do this. I believe I am obeying my conscience in refusing to lie about my convictions. More to the point, though, I believe that I am obeying my conscience with a special rigor in rejecting the majority view that there is a hell of eternal torment, since I am fairly sure that it must be a wicked thing to give one's intellectual assent to something one cannot help but find morally repugnant. I do not rely on conscience alone, however. Without the support of reason, all the conscientiousness in the world would still add up to nothing more than mere personal sentiment. I make no apologies whatsoever for entirely rejecting the late Augustinian tradition regarding the relation between grace and nature, predestination and inherited guilt, and most especially the early modern variants of that tradition, Calvinism, Baroque Thomism, Jansenism, and so forth, that brought it to such extreme expressions. All of that way of seeing things as a matter of simple historical fact rests on catastrophic misreadings of Scripture, abetted by bad translations and anachronistic assumptions regarding the conceptual vocabularies of the authors of the New Testament, as well as, in certain cases, very defective metaphysical reasoning. Even if this were not the case, however, that tradition's sheer moral wretchedness as a vision of the gospel would still render it unworthy of respect. All that said, however, I know also that in these pages I have gone far beyond a mere demurral with one particular stream of Christian thought. I have rejected every version of the infernalist orthodoxy, no matter which Christian tradition may have produced it, and no matter how tender-hearted the reasoning that informs it. To have done otherwise would have been dishonest on my part. There was a time in the early centuries of the church, and especially in the eastern half of the imperial world, when it was still generally assumed that there were mysteries of the faith that should be reserved for only the very few, the Christian intellectual elite, spiritual persons, a term used even by Paul, while the faith of the more common variety of believers should be nourished only with simpler, coarser, more infantile versions of doctrine. For the less learned, less refined, less philosophical Christians, it was widely believed the prospect of hellfire was always the best possible means of promoting good behavior. Even among those who believed in an eventual salvation of all souls, there was perhaps an overly pronounced willingness to indulge in a hint of holy duplicity if that was what it took to inspire spiritual sobriety in the more obdurately cruel and brutish of the baptized. Occasionally, we catch a fugitive glimpse of this patronizing amphiboly in the texts that have come down to us, such as when the great Cappadocian Father Gregory of Nazianzus, 329 to 390, in the course of a sermon on hellfire, pauses ever so slightly to wink mischievously, as it were, at his fellow sophisticates by mentioning that there are some who take a more merciful view of this fire in a way worthier of the one who punishes, and then promptly resumes his dire hellfire and brimstone admonitions to all those lesser intellects in the room. It may offend against our egalitarian principles today, but it was commonly assumed among the very educated of those times that the better part of humanity was something of a hapless rabble who could be made to behave responsibly only by the most terrifying coercions of their imaginations. Belief in universal salvation may have been far more widespread in the first 4 or 5 centuries of Christian history than it was in all the centuries that followed, but it was never, as a rule, encouraged in any general way by those in authority in the church. Perhaps there was some wisdom in this. I am a late modern man and cannot conquer my sense that one has to give everyone the same information if one is to be fair, and I want us all to be fair with one another. But this may be foolish of me. Maybe there are a great many among us who can be convinced to be good only through the threat of endless torture at the hands of an indefatigably vindictive God. Even so much as hint that the purifying flames of the age to come will at the last be extinguished, and perhaps a good number of us will begin to think like the mafioso who refuses to turn state's evidence because he is sure that he can do the time. Bravado is, after all, the chief virtue of the incorrigibly stupid. I hope that this is not really the case, but maybe I am being somewhat quixotic. My actual experiences provide me with, at best, ambiguous evidence in the matter. Still, I am not sufficiently phlegmatic to pull off the charade. I cannot prevaricate about something that strikes me as so very clear in its moral significance. And I certainly cannot believe what I find intrinsically unbelievable. I have never had much respect for the notion of the blind leap of faith, even when that leap is made in the direction of something beautiful and ennobling. I certainly cannot respect it when it is made in the direction of something intrinsically loathsome and degrading. And I believe that this is precisely what the infernalist position, no matter what form it takes, necessarily involves. I have tried to make an honest effort to find an exception to this rule. Over the years, I have dutifully explored all the arguments for hell's eternity from Christian antiquity to the present, philosophical and theological, and I continue to find them all manifestly absurd. Even the gentlest, the most morally delicate, the most judiciously reluctant all start, I believe, on the far side of a prior existential decision to accept an obviously ludicrous premise, and then to proceed as if that premise were not only doctrinally mandatory but rationally inoffensive. God forbid, then, that we ever return to, or even so much as allow ourselves to recall, that initial moment before rationalization began and before that leap of faith was made. Wow. Well, we'll stop there. And David is building his case for the absolute asininity of believing that God would torture people forever and ever. That's just not the truth, ladies and gentlemen. It is something now that has gone on for about 1,500 years and has been promoted with great passion and zeal. But nonetheless, it is still error. When we go back and study the early church fathers and see what they taught, they understood this ultimate restoration of all things through Jesus Christ. They understood the love and the power and the wisdom of God, and that ultimately, as Paul said, God would be all in all.